You don't need the last word. You never did. Something happens. Something gets said. Something crosses a line, and you just go quiet. Not because you didn't notice, not because you didn't care, because you already said everything you needed to say inside your own head, and that was enough. You don't make announcements when you're done with something. You don't send a message explaining where you stand. You don't have a conversation about what changed. You don't bring it up again. You just shift, quietly, completely. And most people don't even realize it happened until they look back and notice you stopped showing up the same way. That's not avoidance. That's not suppression. It just looks that way from the outside. From the inside, it feels like clarity. You've been this way for a long time. You didn't become this way because something broke you. You became this way because you paid attention. You watched how things played out when you did speak up. You saw how little changed, how the same conversations looped back around, how the words got heard but nothing landed. So at some point, you stopped spending energy on outcomes that weren't going to shift. Not bitterly, just quietly. You don't write long messages explaining how you feel. You don't need the other person to understand your reasoning. If they knew you well enough, they wouldn't need the explanation anyway. And if they don't know you that well, the explanation isn't going to bridge that gap. You figured that out a long time ago. You don't replay arguments out loud. You process things internally. You turn something over. You sit with it. You arrive at your own conclusion. And then you move forward. Not loudly, not with any ceremony. You just move. Men around you sometimes read this wrong. They think the quiet means you're fine with something when you're not. They think silence is acceptance. They don't realize that the silence is actually a verdict. You don't correct that assumption, because correcting it would require the kind of conversation you've already decided isn't worth having. You know when something is finished. You feel it before you can explain it. The interest drops, the investment goes flat. You stop leaning in the same way. You stop initiating. You stop making the effort look easy. And you don't announce it. You don't mark the moment. You just stop. Some men still need a confrontation to close the loop. They need the fight. They need the exit scene. They need something dramatic to make a transition feel real. You don't. The loop closes for you long before anything visible happens. The decision gets made in private. The shift is internal first. Everything after that is just the outer world catching up. You can be sitting in a room with someone and already be gone, completely present in your body, completely withdrawn in every other sense, and no one in the room would know. You've walked away from friendships that way, slowly, without a single word about what changed. You've pulled back from conversations that were starting to feel like performance. You stopped feeding dynamics that drained you. You let relationships quietly expire rather than drag them through the kind of confrontation that never actually resolves anything. You stopped explaining yourself in rooms that weren't listening, not in anger, just in recognition that some things don't require a statement. You've been misread for this. People have called you cold, distant, hard to read, hard to reach, and you heard it. You didn't argue with it. You didn't launch into a defense of who you actually are. Because defending yourself to someone who's already decided what you are is a losing trade. You've known that for years. You don't chase understanding from people who aren't looking for it. You're not indifferent. That's the thing people get wrong. You feel things, you notice things. You register disappointment. You register disrespect. You register the moment when something shifts between you and another person. You just don't perform those feelings for an audience. There's a version of emotional expression that's about communication, and there's a version that's about being seen. That second version stopped interesting you a long time ago. You don't need anyone to watch you process something. You're not carrying old resentments silently. That's not what this is. When you let something go, you actually let it go. You don't archive it to bring out later. You don't build a quiet case against someone over years. You just close the door and move forward. That's not suppression. That's economy. You only have so much room inside. You learned not to fill it with things that already ran their course. Here's what's actually happening underneath this. The way you operate isn't a coping strategy. It isn't emotional distance dressed up as maturity. It's something that developed over decades of learning what words actually accomplish and what they don't. When you were younger, you probably tried the direct approach more often. You said what was bothering you, you raised the issue. You had the uncomfortable conversation, and sometimes it helped, and sometimes it did nothing, and sometimes it made things worse. Slowly, you started running an internal calculation on the front end. Before you spoke, before you engaged, before you invested the energy, you were already asking whether this conversation was going to move anything. And when the answer was no, you didn't have it. That calculation got faster and more accurate over time. Now it happens almost instantly. You walk into a situation, read the landscape, and know within minutes whether words are going to be worth the expenditure. When they aren't, you go quiet. Not passive, not absent, quiet. There's a difference between a man who goes silent because he doesn't know what to say and a man who goes silent because he's already said it in his own mind. You're the second type. The silence is full. There's a complete thought behind it, a complete conclusion. You just don't feel the need to externalize it. This comes from a particular relationship with your own inner life. You trust your own processing. You don't need to talk something through out loud to reach a conclusion. You don't need external validation to confirm that what you're feeling is real or reasonable. You arrived at that self-trust gradually. It came from years of sitting with your own conclusions and watching them prove accurate. You also learned something that a lot of men never quite absorb. You learned that other people's understanding of you is not something you can control. You can explain yourself clearly, carefully, with full intention, and still be misread, still be misrepresented, still have the other person hear something entirely different from what you said. Once you understood that, the urgency to explain yourself dropped significantly. If you can't guarantee the outcome of an explanation, the explanation becomes optional. You became very selective about when it was worth offering. This is not a defense mechanism. It's a resource allocation decision. Your attention is finite. Your emotional energy is finite. You stopped spending it on closed doors. There's also something else operating here. You have a very low tolerance for the kind of conversation that's really just performance, where both people are talking but neither one is actually trying to understand anything, where the goal isn't resolution. The goal is winning or being heard or releasing frustration. That kind of conversation feels like noise to you, and you stopped walking into it voluntarily. You can tell within the first 2 minutes whether a conversation is going to produce anything real. And when you see that it isn't, something in you just disengages. Not rudely, not visibly. You stay in the room. You remain composed, but internally, you've already moved on. Most men your age operate on a tight internal economy. What you give your attention to, what you give your energy to, what you give your words to, all of it gets weighed. You became a man who does not spend freely. You became a man who invests selectively. That shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. It was built through experience, through situations where you spent yourself freely and got nothing back worth the price. And over time, without making a conscious decision, you started conserving. This is not emotional unavailability. It gets read that way from the outside. People who need external processing, people who need the conversation to happen out loud, to feel like something was resolved, they don't always understand a man who can reach resolution without it. They see the silence and assume nothing is happening inside. They're wrong. You are one of the most internally active men in any room you walk into. You're processing constantly, observing, weighing, arriving at conclusions. The absence of external expression isn't an absence of thought, it's the opposite. The silence is not a wall, it's a filter. You're not keeping people out. You're letting through what's worth letting through. And the things that don't make it past that filter, the noise, the performance, the circular conversations, the dynamics that have already proven they don't lead anywhere real, those get set down, quietly, without ceremony. The men who know you well understand this. They don't need you to narrate everything. They don't need the running commentary. They feel what's underneath the silence and they trust it. Those are the relationships that have lasted. The ones that fell away, most of them didn't fall away because you were cold or distant or hard to reach. They fell away because they required a version of you that you outgrew, a version that performed openness, that explained himself constantly, That chased understanding from rooms that weren't offering it. That version got retired, and you didn't mourn it. What you carry instead is something quieter and more solid, a relationship with your own conclusions that doesn't depend on anyone else confirming them, a way of moving through the world that doesn't require an audience, a capacity to close a door completely and keep walking. That's not damage. That's not avoidance dressed in different clothing. That's a man who knows what his time and energy are worth, a man who stopped paying full price for zero return, a man who figured out through years of actual living that the loudest people in any room are rarely the ones with the most clarity. You don't need the last word. You never did, because you already know what the last word was going to be. And you made your peace with it before anyone else even knew something had shifted. You let things go without saying a word. Not because you're numb, not because you don't care, because caring, for a man like you, was never something you needed to perform. Some things just complete themselves in private. The decision gets made, the door closes, the weight drops, and you keep moving. No announcement, no explanation, no request for anyone to understand what just happened. You already understood it. That was always enough.